Well, good morning and welcome to another episode of GSG here on Gorsley Youth's very own YouTube channel. We are going through a series at the moment of answering your questions. Questions that you asked us back in February. We are now getting around to answering. So far in our series we have looked at dinosaurs and where did they fit into the Bible. And we have looked at why does God allow so much suffering. Well, today we're going to be having a look at God's own suffering, having a look at the question of why did Jesus go through the pain? Simply put, because he thinks you're worth it. When he looks at you, he sees someone worth dying for. He sees someone worth going through all of that pain for. Now, that may sound a little bit far-fetched and a little bit out there. Well, to understand that, we're going to have to rewind the clock about 3,500 years to the time of Moses. So come with me on a journey into the Old Testament to find out why Jesus went through all of that pain. Let's rewind. Wow, welcome to roughly 1,500 years BC, 3,500 years ago, to the time of Moses. Now, Moses led God's people out of Egypt, where they had been in slavery for 400 years. They had been oppressed as a people group and forced to build two massive cities in ancient Egypt. Until, of course, when God sends Moses and he leads them out of Egypt through the Red Sea on dry land out into the Sinai desert. They were finally free. They were free, completely free, surrounded by sand, and more sand. There was nothing out there for them, apart from, of course, manna and quail that God provided for them, and there was roughly 1 million people. So they weren't really alone, but by and large, one people group, God's people alone, a fresh start. So God had to give them a few rules to help them live the best lives that they could live out in the desert. Now park that thought there and rewind even further back now to the Garden of Eden, where we find, you know it, Adam and Eve. Let's rewind again. Whoa! Welcome to the Garden of Eden. Welcome to the Garden of Eden. Here, the garden was perfect. It was beautiful. There was nothing bad about the Garden of Eden, full of beautiful flowers, full of good things. And there lived a happily married couple, Adam and Eve. But they were not alone. God was there with them. In Genesis 3, we read about how God would walk through the garden in the cool of the day. Adam and Eve had a perfect relationship with God in the garden. But we know, don't we, that later on in that story, Adam and Eve rebelled against God. They disobeyed him and did his own thing, and they were cast out of the garden. Just like that. That perfect relationship that they had with God was suddenly gone. The word that we use to describe disobeying God is sin, which basically means anything that we do where we choose to do our thing rather than God's thing. Adam and Eve sinned. They disobeyed God and they did their own thing. And the consequence of that was that they were cast out of the Garden of Eden. It says that thorns then infested the ground. People began to suffer for what they were doing. Work became hard work. People started dying. We know, don't we, that Romans 6 verse 23 tells us that the wages of sin is death. The cost of sin, the consequence of sin is death. The consequence for disobeying God is ultimately death. Now park that thought and we're going to fast forward back to the time of Moses. And we find ourselves watching this amazing conversation, albeit a one-sided one, between God and Moses. Leviticus chapter 1 to 8 is this huge one-sided conversation where God is saying all of these things to Moses. Don't forget, they were this baby nation. They didn't have any rules or regulations, so it could have just been absolute carnage. Think of a school playground with no rules. Crazy. So God laid out a few rules, a few guidelines, if you like, for 8 chapters. And it goes like this. Only joking. I'm not going to read the whole 8 chapters, but it can be summarized in this verse from 5:5. Leviticus 5, chapter 5. When anyone is found guilty of any of these things, they must confess in what they have done, and as a penalty for the sin they have committed, they must bring to the Lord a female lamb or goat from the flock as a sin offering, and the priest shall make atonement for him for his sin. If he cannot afford a lamb, he is to bring 2 doves or 2 young pigeons for a sin offering and offer them on the burnt altar. And if they can't even afford that, they can bring some flour or some grain. So, the cost of a person's sin in the time of Moses was the death of an animal, a lamb, a goat, a dove, or a pigeon. Something had to die to pay the price for their disobedience towards God. Remember the sacrifice of the Passover lamb? Jewish families had to choose a perfect lamb, one without any blemish or defect, and sacrifice it and kill it. Now, God must have realised that this was not going to be a sustainable model for making their sins right with Him. So, come with me now to Isaiah chapter 9. Verses 1 to 9 are what we call messianic prophecies, which are basically a foretelling of Jesus. See if you recognise these words. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned. You have enlarged the nation and increased their joy. They rejoice before you as people rejoice at the harvest. For to us a child is born. To us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. He will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. So, about 800 years before Jesus' birth, we have these words being written about God's rescue plan. God's plan for restoring the broken relationship with Himself and His people. Isaiah 53, verse 6 and 7. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us have turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid on Him, that's Jesus, the iniquity, the wrongdoing of us all. He, Jesus, was oppressed and afflicted, yet He did not open His mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is silent, He did not open His mouth. Jesus went to the cross willingly, knowing what it would cost Him. But Jesus didn't do that as a one-time thing. He did that as a one-time for all time kind of thing. In Psalm 103, it tells us that as far as the east is from the west, that is how far He has removed our wrongdoing from us. So Jesus went through the pain to remove our wrongdoing from us and to remove the consequence of our wrongdoing, so that you and I can be brought back into that relationship with God that Adam and Eve enjoyed way back in the time of the Garden of Eden. But He didn't do it because He had to. He did it because He wanted to. Have a look at Hebrews 12, verse 2. There it tells us that for the joy set before him, Jesus endured the cross, scorning its shame. For the joy that was set before him, Jesus was led to the cross. Now, he knew what that would have meant. He knew that would have meant nails being driven through his hands, nails being driven through his feet, a spear being thrust into his side, hanging there naked before many, many people, being laughed at, being scoffed at, being jeered at. He knew that he would have to have hung on that cross until he was dead. But he endured it for the joy that was set after it. See, yes, Jesus knew what it entailed dying on that cross, but Jesus knew what the result of that would have been. He knew that millions upon millions of people would then have the opportunity to be brought back into a relationship with him from every tribe and tongue, from every corner of the world. Jesus going through the pain on the cross threw open the gates so that you and I can be brought back into that relationship. Why did Jesus go through the pain? He went through the pain because he wants you. Jesus knew that by going through the pain on the cross, he would be satisfying God. He would be pleasing God. He would be completing the law laid down in the Old Testament. He would be doing away completely with the old way of doing things and bringing in a new era for God's people. A new era not only for the nation of Israel, but for the whole world to be included in God's family. Romans chapter 5 explains it really, really clearly for us in verse 18. Just as the result of one man's sin was condemnation for all men, so also the result of one act of righteousness was justification that brings life for all men. Sin entered the world through one man, that was Adam, and sin was dealt with through one man, that's Jesus. Now, your question to us today was, why did Jesus go through the pain? As I mentioned earlier, simply put, because he thinks you're worth it. But he went through the pain because he became that sacrifice. So we no longer have to bring lambs and goats and pigeons and doves and flour and grain and wheat and all sorts of things to make our sin right before God. That sacrifice has been made for us in the person of Jesus. So in this small amount of time that we've had in this video, that is why Jesus went through the pain. He did it for you because he loves you and he wants a relationship with you. Now, I don't know where you're at today with your relationship with God, wherever you are watching this video from, but may I encourage you, because of what Jesus has done for you, may you give him a try today. Why not go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father in heaven. And start that conversation. Start rebuilding that relationship with God for yourself personally that was lost way back in the time of Adam and Eve. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for Jesus. Thank you that because of what Jesus did on the cross, we can have a relationship with you. Father, thank you that even though we may not understand why Jesus would go through all of that pain, thank you that he did. And thank you that because of it, we can be in a relationship with you today. Amen. Have a great week, guys. We'll see you next week when we answer another question. See you soon.